Qin Shi Huang, the first emperor of China, is one of the most enigmatic and controversial figures in world history. His rise from the king of the small state of Qin to the ruler of a unified China in 221 BCE marked a turning point in human civilization. He was the man who standardized writing, currency, and measurements, the man who connected and expanded massive sections of the Great Wall, and the man who dreamed of ruling not only China but perhaps eternity itself. Yet, behind his achievements lies a dark legacy of obsession, paranoia, and ruthlessness. Among the most chilling legends associated with him is the claim that he sacrificed 100,000 soldiers to build his tomb, a vast underground mausoleum designed to mirror the heavens and guard him for eternity. But is this tale a fact rooted in archaeological evidence, or is it a myth born of fear and exaggeration? The story of Qin Shi Huang begins long before his death. Born as Zhang in 259 BCE, he became king of the state of Qin at the age of 13 after the death of his father. Surrounded by warlords, political schemers, and enemies within his own court, he grew up in an environment where trust was scarce and survival demanded cold calculation. By his teenage years, he was already making ruthless decisions to eliminate rivals and consolidate power. His ambition was limitless, and through a series of brutal wars, he crushed the 6 rival states that had divided China for centuries. In 221 BCE, he proclaimed himself Shi Huangdi, the first emperor, declaring that his dynasty would last for 10,000 generations. He believed that his reign was not just political, but cosmic, ordained by the mandate of heaven, and that his legacy must be eternal. From the moment he unified China, Qin Shi Huang began planning his tomb. According to the ancient historian Sima Qian, writing in the records of the Grand Historian about a century after the emperor's death, construction of the mausoleum began as soon as he took the throne of Qin as a young king and continued for almost 4 decades. Sima Qian describes a project of unimaginable scale, with hundreds of thousands of laborers, artisans, and soldiers conscripted to carve chambers, build walls, and craft treasures meant to accompany the emperor into the afterlife. At the heart of these records lies the controversial claim that Qin Shi Huang ordered vast numbers of people, including his own soldiers, to be buried alive within his tomb to serve him in death as they had in life. Some versions of the legend claim 100,000, others more. But what does the evidence say? The tomb itself remains largely unexcavated to this day, sealed beneath a massive burial mound near modern Xi'an. What archaeologists have uncovered, however, is enough to astonish the world. In 1974, local farmers digging a well stumbled upon fragments of what would become known as the Terracotta Army, thousands of life-sized clay soldiers, horses, and chariots buried in battle formation. Each figure is unique, with individualized faces, hairstyles, and armor, as if modeled after real men who once lived. The discovery was hailed as one of the greatest archaeological finds of the 20th century. The Terracotta Army seems to confirm Sima Qian's account of a vast underground world built to protect Qin Shi Huang in the afterlife. Yet it also raises deeper questions. Why would an emperor who already commanded the labor of an entire empire need to sacrifice real soldiers if he could create clay replicas to stand guard forever? Was the story of mass sacrifice propaganda, intended to paint him as a tyrant in later centuries? Or does it hide a terrible truth waiting to be uncovered? To understand the legend, we must look at the historical context. In ancient China, death was not an ending but a continuation. Emperors and kings believed that the afterlife mirrored the living world. Just as they needed armies, servants, and riches in life, so too would they require them in death. Earlier rulers of the Zhou dynasty and other states had indeed buried living servants, concubines, and sometimes soldiers with them. Archaeological evidence shows that human sacrifice was not uncommon in early Chinese burials, though it declined over time. By the Warring States period, it was more typical to use figurines or symbolic objects instead of live humans. Qin Shi Huang, however, was no ordinary ruler. His obsession with immortality was legendary. He sent expeditions in search of the elixir of life, consulted magicians and alchemists, and consumed mercury pills believing they would make him live forever. If he believed that a real army was needed to guard him in the next world, would it have been beyond him to demand a sacrifice on a scale never seen before? The figure of 100,000 soldiers is staggering, but we must ask, could such a number be logistically possible? The Qin dynasty at its height commanded hundreds of thousands of troops. To lose 100,000 to sacrifice would have been militarily disastrous, especially given the constant need to guard borders and suppress rebellions. On the other hand, Qin Shi Huang was notorious for wasteful and monumental projects, from the Great Wall to massive palaces. To him, the practical cost may have been irrelevant compared to the symbolic power of absolute control, even beyond death. Another layer of complexity comes from the historical sources. Sima Qian's records are our main written account, but Sima was writing under the Han dynasty, which overthrew the Qin. The Han rulers had every reason to vilify their predecessors, portraying Qin Shi Huang as a cruel despot whose dynasty collapsed within 15 years due to his tyranny. Could the story of burying 100,000 soldiers alive have been an exaggeration, or even propaganda designed to blacken his name? Archaeology provides tantalizing but incomplete answers. In addition to the terracotta army, excavations have revealed evidence of mass graves around the mausoleum complex, with human remains that suggest some workers were indeed killed or sacrificed. Whether these were soldiers, slaves, or artisans remains uncertain. Some scholars argue that many laborers were executed after the tomb's completion to keep its secrets safe. Others suggest epidemics or exhaustion claimed their lives. The precise truth is elusive, hidden beneath centuries of soil and imperial secrecy. What is clear is that Qin Shi Huang's mausoleum was designed to project power beyond comprehension. Rivers of mercury, according to ancient texts, flowed through underground chambers to mimic real landscapes. Stars and constellations were painted on ceilings to mirror the heavens. Treasures and weapons were sealed away. And somewhere in that vast underground city lies the emperor himself, surrounded by an army that may or may not have once been flesh and blood. As we begin this journey to explore whether the sacrifice of 100,000 soldiers was truth or myth, we must balance legend, archaeology, and logic. Qin Shi Huang was a man who defied limits, whose dreams bordered on madness, and whose paranoia knew no bounds. To dismiss the legend outright would be naive, but to accept it without question would also be unwise. In the chapters ahead, we will dive deeper into the evidence, the myths, and the enduring mystery of the first emperor's tomb. For buried beneath the mound at Xi'an lies not just a man, but a riddle that has haunted humanity for over 2,000 years. The question of whether Qin Shi Huang truly sacrificed 100,000 soldiers at his tomb cannot be separated from the way ancient records portray him. The most important source we have is Sima Qian's Shiji, or Records of the Grand Historian, compiled around 100 BCE, roughly a century after the first emperor's death. Sima Qian describes a tomb so vast and elaborate that it required years of continuous labor and the involvement of hundreds of thousands of workers. He recounts details such as rivers of flowing mercury, palaces and towers built underground, and celestial maps painted on ceilings. Yet he also notes that those who constructed the tomb were buried inside to prevent them from revealing its secrets. This chilling detail gives rise to the possibility of mass sacrifice. The problem, however, lies in the reliability of these records. Sima Qian was not a neutral historian. He wrote under the Han dynasty, which had every incentive to demonize the Qin. By portraying Qin Shi Huang as a tyrant who wasted human lives and committed unspeakable atrocities, the Han legitimized their own rule as more benevolent and justified. Thus, we must ask whether the claim of mass sacrifice was based on fact, or whether it was deliberately exaggerated. Even if Sima Qian exaggerated, we must also recognize that ancient China did have traditions of human sacrifice, particularly among the ruling elite. Early rulers of the Shang dynasty, centuries before Qin Shi Huang, often buried slaves, concubines, and soldiers alive with them. Archaeological excavations at Anyang, the Shang capital, reveal tombs with dozens or even hundreds of human skeletons interred alongside rulers. By the Zhou dynasty, the practice declined, replaced gradually by symbolic substitutes such as clay figurines. But Qin Shi Huang's ambition to surpass all predecessors may have driven him to revive or expand upon ancient customs. To him, no price was too high if it secured his immortality in the afterlife. His obsession with immortality is well documented. Qin Shi Huang was haunted by fear of death and constantly searched for ways to extend his life. He dispatched expeditions to distant seas in search of the mythical islands of the immortals, said to be home to sages with elixirs of eternal life. Legends tell of Su Fu, an alchemist who led thousands of men and women on a voyage to find these elixirs and never returned, perhaps settling in Japan. The emperor also consumed mercury-based potions prescribed by alchemists, ironically poisoning himself and hastening his demise. Within this context, it is not hard to imagine that he might believe sacrificing living soldiers would guarantee a loyal army in the afterlife. The number 100,000 may strike us as exaggerated, but it carried symbolic weight in ancient China. Numbers in historical texts were often used to indicate magnitude rather than precise counts. For example, saying 10,000 generations was a formula to suggest eternity, not a literal calculation. Thus, the story of 100,000 soldiers may not mean exactly that figure but rather a vast, uncountable multitude. The ambiguity allows both possibilities. Either a smaller, yet still shocking number of soldiers were buried alive, or the entire account was invented to emphasize his cruelty. Archaeology provides some clues, though incomplete. The mausoleum complex at Lintong is enormous, covering more than 50 square kilometers. To this day, only a fraction has been excavated, and the central burial chamber remains sealed due to concerns over preservation. Around the site, archaeologists have found pits with human remains. Some appear to be laborers who died from exhaustion or were executed to keep the tomb's secrets. Others might have been sacrificial victims. However, nothing conclusively proves the scale of 100,000. What we do see is evidence of mass mobilization. Estimates suggest up to 700,000 laborers were conscripted over decades to construct the tomb. Many of these men were criminals, peasants, or conquered enemies forced into service. Whether they died naturally from overwork or through deliberate sacrifice, the human cost was immense. The terracotta army itself complicates the story. These life-sized clay warriors are so detailed that they appear modeled after real individuals. Each face is unique, and some scholars propose they were based on actual soldiers of Qin. If this is the case, then the army may have symbolically replaced the need for live human sacrifice. Instead of burying real soldiers, the emperor might have commanded artisans to immortalize his troops in clay. Yet skeptics argue that the very existence of such lifelike statues suggests a deeper, darker inspiration. Perhaps these clay figures were modeled after men who had indeed been sacrificed or executed. One must also consider the emperor's psychology. Qin Shi Huang ruled with absolute power and demanded total obedience. He ordered the burning of books and the burying of scholars alive to suppress dissent. He drove hundreds of thousands to labor on the Great Wall, many of whom perished in the process. For a ruler who treated human life as expendable, the notion of sacrificing soldiers to guard his tomb does not stretch credibility. The question becomes not whether he was capable, but whether it truly happened on such a scale. Skeptics point out that sacrificing trained soldiers would weaken the Qin military, something an emperor obsessed with security would avoid. Supporters of the legend counter that the Qin Empire, at its peak, fielded hundreds of thousands of troops. Losing a fraction might not cripple its defenses, especially if the emperor believed the sacrifice would grant him eternal supremacy. Furthermore, some suggest that the victims may not have been active soldiers at all but disgraced troops, prisoners of war, or convicts forced into military service. In that case, the phrase 100,000 soldiers may have referred broadly to people of military rank or background, not the empire's standing army. Beyond history and archaeology lies the layer of myth-making. Qin Shi Huang's tomb became a symbol of both awe and terror. The idea of an emperor who enslaved even the dead resonated through centuries of folklore. Later dynasties used the tale as a moral lesson. Tyranny leads to downfall. The Qin dynasty collapsed within 15 years of the first emperor's death, seemingly proving that his cruelty cursed his line. Storytellers may have embellished the narrative of sacrifice to reinforce this moral. Modern scholars remain divided. Some argue that the story is largely myth, pointing to the lack of definitive archaeological evidence and the political biases of Han historians. Others believe that while the number is exaggerated, there is a kernel of truth. Perhaps thousands, not hundreds of thousands, were sacrificed. The truth may lie somewhere between legend and fact. What is undeniable is that Qin Shi Huang's mausoleum represents one of the most ambitious funerary projects in history, and its construction consumed countless lives, whether through forced labor, execution, or sacrifice. The emperor's obsession with immortality and control shaped not only his life but also his death, leaving behind a tomb shrouded in mystery and horror. As we move forward, we must examine not only the evidence but also the cultural, spiritual, and political forces that shaped this legend. Why did later generations cling to the idea of 100,000 sacrificed soldiers? What does it reveal about the way power, fear, and myth intertwine in human memory? These questions will guide us deeper into the labyrinth of the first emperor's legacy, where truth and myth merge, and where the darkness of one man's ambition still casts a shadow over the ages. The mystery of Qin Shi Huang's alleged sacrifice of 100,000 soldiers cannot be solved without carefully looking at the archaeology around his mausoleum. In 1974, when local farmers near Xi'an dug a well, they found fragments of clay statues that turned out to be one of the greatest archaeological discoveries of the 20th century: the terracotta army. What appeared at first to be scattered pieces of pottery revealed itself as a massive underground army created to guard the emperor in the afterlife. Today, thousands of figures have been excavated, including more than 8,000 life-size soldiers, along with horses, chariots, and weapons. Each warrior is unique, with distinct facial features, hairstyles, armor, and expressions. The level of individuality suggests that the figures may have been modeled after real soldiers, making them not just symbolic but also deeply personal representations of Qin Shi Huang's power. The presence of this clay army raises immediate questions about the legend of mass sacrifice. If such an army of eternal guardians was created, why would the emperor need to bury living men alive? Some scholars argue that the terracotta army itself was intended to replace the older practice of human sacrifice. In earlier dynasties, rulers buried slaves and soldiers with them to serve in the afterlife. By creating clay replicas, Qin Shi Huang might have demonstrated a symbolic shift, using art and craftsmanship to immortalize his power rather than killing loyal subjects. Yet others insist that the existence of the terracotta army does not necessarily mean that no humans were sacrificed. The two could have coexisted: clay warriors as a visible army for eternity, and human lives taken to appease spirits or seal secrets. Archaeological excavations have revealed more than statues. Around the mausoleum complex, which spans over 50 square kilometers, traces of large-scale construction remain. Workshops and kilns for firing clay figures have been unearthed, alongside tools and remnants of weapons. Most disturbingly, human remains have been found scattered in the vicinity. Some skeletons display evidence of violent death, including fractures or positions suggesting sudden burial. Scholars debate whether these remains belong to soldiers, laborers, or craftsmen. One interpretation is that many workers were killed after the mausoleum was finished to prevent them from revealing its secrets. Others suggest mass deaths due to exhaustion, poor conditions, or epidemics during construction. Either way, the graves around the site confirm that lives were lost in large numbers. The exact role of soldiers in this tragedy remains unclear. Could they have been among those sacrificed, or were the victims primarily slaves and criminals forced into labor? The scale of the project itself lends weight to the legend. Historical texts claim that up to 700,000 people were conscripted to build the tomb. Even if not all were sacrificed, countless must have died from overwork and harsh treatment. In this sense, the mausoleum was already a site of mass death, whether or not soldiers were formally executed in ritual sacrifice. The presence of weapons in the terracotta pits also adds to the mystery. Archaeologists have found bronze swords, spears, and crossbow mechanisms, many preserved in remarkable condition. Some were sharpened to lethal edges, suggesting they were not purely ceremonial. The idea that the clay army was armed with real weapons has led some to wonder whether living soldiers were entombed alongside them to provide actual defense. However, no clear evidence of soldiers buried alive in full formation has yet been discovered. What makes interpretation even more complicated is that the central burial chamber of Qin Shi Huang remains sealed. Archaeologists have avoided opening it due to concerns about preservation and potential hazards. Ancient records describe rivers of mercury flowing inside the chamber to represent real landscapes, and modern soil testing around the mound has indeed revealed unusually high levels of mercury. If true, the chamber may contain wonders never before seen, but until it is excavated, the truth remains locked away. It is entirely possible that if sacrifices occurred, the evidence lies within the unopened chamber. Folklore and local legends add another layer to the story. Villagers in the region have long told tales of strange lights, poisonous vapors, and curses surrounding the tomb. Some stories claim that cries and moans can be heard at night, attributed to the souls of those sacrificed. While such tales cannot be taken as factual evidence, they reflect the enduring cultural memory that lives were lost in constructing and sealing the mausoleum. These narratives, passed down through centuries, reinforce the belief that Qin Shi Huang's quest for immortality demanded blood. Skeptics, however, argue that many of these legends emerged later, shaped by the Han dynasty's negative portrayal of the Qin. They see the 100,000 soldiers as a symbolic exaggeration meant to illustrate cruelty rather than an actual historical figure. The discovery of clay warriors could have been interpreted by common people as confirmation that real soldiers were also buried. In the absence of complete excavation, the legend thrived. Another crucial detail is the treatment of the terracotta army itself. The statues were originally painted in vibrant colors, but most of the pigment has faded. Still, traces reveal that the army once stood in lifelike hues, as though real men had been transformed into eternal guardians. The artistic choice suggests not just representation but an attempt to animate the figures, bridging the boundary between life and death. Could this have been a substitute for real soldiers, or was it an artistic echo of sacrifices already made? The scale of logistics also plays a role in evaluating the plausibility of mass sacrifice. Burying 100,000 soldiers would have required enormous preparation, food, and management. It would also have weakened the Qin military, leaving borders vulnerable. Supporters of the legend counter that Qin Shi Huang's paranoia and hunger for control outweighed practical concerns. To him, an eternal guard in the afterlife might have seemed more critical than maintaining balance in the living world. Still, no evidence of such a massive burial pit has yet been uncovered, and absence of proof weighs heavily against the most extreme version of the story. Yet, even without direct evidence, the human cost of the mausoleum is undeniable. Whether soldiers, laborers, or craftsmen, tens of thousands perished in its making. Their deaths, whether from sacrifice, exhaustion, or secrecy, contributed to the aura of terror surrounding the first emperor's legacy. The site stands not just as a monument to ambition but as a graveyard of human suffering. In many ways, the debate over the 100,000 soldiers reflects the larger tension between myth and history. Archaeology provides facts. Clay figures, human remains, mercury traces. Legends provide narratives. Sacrifices, curses, eternal armies. The truth may lie between them, shaped by both real events and centuries of retelling. Until the central chamber is opened, the silence of the tomb keeps its secrets intact. As we continue to explore, we must hold both possibilities in mind. That Qin Shi Huang immortalized his soldiers in clay, or that he condemned them to die with him in darkness. The truth, when finally revealed, may confirm one story, or it may astonish us with something no one has yet imagined. To understand the persistence of the legend that Qin Shi Huang sacrificed 100,000 soldiers, one must examine the political climate of the time and the way his image was shaped by later generations. Qin Shi Huang was the first man in Chinese history to unify the warring states under one centralized rule. His accomplishments were monumental. He standardized the script so people across vast regions could communicate in the same written language. He introduced uniform currency and measurements, and he built roads that linked distant provinces. These reforms laid the foundations of Chinese civilization for centuries. Yet his methods were ruthless. He ruled with absolute authority, demanding obedience from subjects and crushing dissent with violence. The Qin dynasty enforced strict laws under the legalist philosophy, a doctrine that prized order and control over compassion and tradition. Legalist thinkers like Han Feizi argued that people were inherently selfish and could only be governed through strict punishments and rewards. Qin Shi Huang embraced this philosophy wholeheartedly. Under his reign, even minor crimes could lead to harsh punishments such as mutilation or execution. Families were held collectively responsible for crimes, ensuring fear spread through entire communities. This environment of oppression created a climate in which legends of mass sacrifice could easily take root. People already believed their ruler capable of extreme cruelty, so the idea of him burying soldiers alive at his tomb seemed plausible. Political propaganda also played a decisive role. After the Qin dynasty collapsed in 206 BCE, the Han dynasty rose to power. The Han rulers, seeking to legitimize themselves, portrayed the Qin as a failed experiment in tyranny. By exaggerating the cruelty of Qin Shi Huang, the Han could present themselves as more humane and benevolent. Sima Qian's Records of the Grand Historian, though a masterpiece of early history, was written in this political context. His depiction of Qin Shi Huang emphasized paranoia, wastefulness, and brutality. Tales of book burnings, scholars buried alive, and soldiers sacrificed in vast numbers served as moral lessons. Tyranny leads to downfall. The Qin dynasty's rapid collapse reinforced this narrative. Despite unifying China, the dynasty lasted only 15 years after the first emperor's death. Heavy taxation, forced labor projects, and military campaigns exhausted the population. Rebellions erupted, and the dynasty crumbled under its own weight. The downfall was so dramatic that it seemed natural to blame it on the emperor's cruelty. Legends of mass sacrifice became both explanation and cautionary tale. Yet the truth is more complex. Qin Shi Huang was undoubtedly ruthless, but his policies also created enduring structures. The centralized bureaucracy he built survived long after the Qin, forming the backbone of imperial China. His reforms in writing, currency, and law were adopted by the Han and beyond. In this sense, his legacy was not just cruelty but also statecraft. Still, cruelty remained the dominant theme in popular memory. Why? Because stories of cruelty are memorable, shocking, and easy to pass down. Ordinary people who suffered under Qin's heavy hand had every reason to tell tales of his monstrous deeds. Later storytellers, seeking dramatic effect, amplified these tales. Over time, the image of Qin Shi Huang as a bloodthirsty tyrant overshadowed his role as a unifier. The myth of 100,000 sacrificed soldiers reflects this cultural memory. From a political perspective, the legend also served to explain why the Qin dynasty, despite its strength, collapsed so quickly. If the emperor wasted human lives on such a colossal and selfish project, then the gods must have punished him and his dynasty. In Confucian moral logic, rulers were judged not only by their success but by their virtue. Qin Shi Huang failed the test of virtue, so his dynasty was doomed. Thus, the legend reinforced both political propaganda and moral philosophy. Archaeological evidence of forced labor, mass graves, and the colossal scale of the mausoleum gave the legend a veneer of plausibility. Even if the exact number of sacrificed soldiers was exaggerated, the suffering of countless workers was real. The Great Wall, another monumental project, consumed the lives of thousands who died from hunger, exhaustion, or exposure. To ordinary people, whether soldiers or peasants, Qin Shi Huang's reign felt like an endless demand for blood and sweat. Therefore, when people heard that he sacrificed soldiers at his tomb, it matched their lived reality. The Han dynasty's interest in vilifying the Qin also extended into literature and drama. Over centuries, poets, playwrights, and storytellers repeated and embellished tales of Qin cruelty. The story of the emperor burying scholars alive became a symbol of intellectual oppression. The tale of sacrificed soldiers symbolized his disregard for human life. Even in later dynasties, these stories were told not just as history but as warnings to rulers. Cruelty will lead to downfall. Another dimension is the psychological impact of Qin Shi Huang's obsession with immortality. His relentless search for the elixir of life, his reliance on alchemists, and his willingness to consume mercury pills made him appear both desperate and delusional. To later generations, Such behavior seemed insane, further justifying tales of irrational cruelty. If a man was mad enough to poison himself in pursuit of immortality, then perhaps he was also mad enough to bury 100,000 soldiers alive. Cultural memory often works by exaggeration. The actual number of victims may have been in the thousands, but exaggeration to 100,000 amplified the horror and made the story unforgettable. Numbers in ancient texts were not always literal. They were symbolic. 100,000 could simply mean an enormous number. Thus, the legend may be an exaggerated reflection of real deaths, transformed into a symbolic figure of unimaginable cruelty. In modern times, the legend continues to shape perceptions of Qin Shi Huang. Movies, novels, and documentaries often emphasize the darker aspects of his rule. The image of the first emperor surrounded by clay soldiers, sealed in a tomb built on sacrifice, captivates the imagination. Even without proof of 100,000 soldiers buried alive, the idea resonates because it fits the archetype of the tyrant who enslaves even the dead. The politics of memory ensure that the story endures. Qin Shi Huang's true legacy lies at the intersection of history and myth. He was both a visionary and a despot, a unifier and a destroyer. His tomb remains one of the greatest mysteries of archaeology, holding secrets that may one day confirm or deny the legend. Until then, the tale of 100,000 sacrificed soldiers continues to haunt the story of China's first emperor, reminding us that history is not just a record of facts but a battlefield of narratives where power, propaganda, and memory collide. When we consider the story of Qin Shi Huang and the alleged sacrifice of 100,000 soldiers, we must also confront the undeniable fact that his mausoleum consumed countless human lives, regardless of whether formal rituals of sacrifice occurred. Ancient sources describe a workforce of 700,000 men conscripted from across the empire, a staggering number that illustrates the colossal scale of the project. These men were not volunteers. Many were prisoners of war, convicts, peasants, and sometimes even disgraced soldiers who had no choice but to labor under brutal conditions. To them, the line between forced labor and sacrificial death blurred, for the outcome was often the same. They never returned home. Archaeological evidence supports this grim reality. Around the mausoleum complex, mass graves have been discovered containing human remains, many of them hastily buried. Some show signs of malnutrition, disease, and injuries consistent with heavy labor. Others appear to have been executed, possibly to maintain secrecy about the tomb's construction. The workforce lived and died in a closed system with no chance of escape. If they attempted to flee, the punishment was death. If they survived the work, they might still be killed once their role was completed. In this sense, every laborer was both a worker and a potential victim of sacrifice. Conditions on the project were unimaginably harsh. The men were tasked with moving enormous quantities of earth, carving chambers, building walls, and producing clay figures and weapons. Without modern machinery, all this required sheer human strength. Workers carried loads on their backs, hauled stone with ropes, and dug tunnels with crude tools. Exhaustion was constant, food was scarce, and disease spread easily in the crowded camps. Many must have perished from simple hunger, heat stroke, or infection. The mausoleum became not just a construction site but a machine that consumed human life. This reality complicates the legend of sacrificed soldiers. While we may not find direct evidence of soldiers ceremonially buried alive, we cannot ignore the fact that soldiers, peasants, and criminals alike were sent to the site and many never returned. To their families, the outcome was indistinguishable from sacrifice. Their lives were given to the emperor's tomb, whether by ritual decree or by slow death through labor. In this way, the legend may represent not literal sacrifice but the collective memory of massive loss. It is also important to consider the role of secrecy. Qin Shi Huang was obsessed with control and feared betrayal. The mausoleum was his most guarded secret, for it held treasures, weapons, and perhaps even traps designed to protect him in the afterlife. To ensure secrecy, those who built it could not be allowed to live freely afterward. Historical texts claim that artisans and workers were sealed inside the tomb once it was complete. If true, this would mean thousands were entombed alive, sacrificed not as warriors but as keepers of secrets. The image of soldiers sacrificed may have emerged from this practice, as guards or laborers were entombed alongside clay warriors. The scale of the project also created ripple effects across the empire. With hundreds of thousands of men taken from farms and villages, agricultural production declined. Families were left without sons and fathers, leading to famine and hardship. The weight of this burden contributed to widespread resentment. By the time Qin Shi Huang died, the empire was already simmering with unrest, and within a few years it collapsed under rebellion. Thus, the mausoleum not only consumed lives directly but also destabilized the empire indirectly. From the perspective of the common people, the emperor had indeed sacrificed his subjects, if not by ritual execution, then by forcing them into conditions that led to death. This broader interpretation of sacrifice helps explain why the legend of 100,000 soldiers persists. It captures the sense of collective suffering inflicted by the emperor's obsession. In Chinese tradition, memory of suffering often transforms into myth. Over generations, the harsh realities of forced labor may have merged with stories of deliberate sacrifice, producing a narrative that was both symbolic and believable. The soldiers in the legend may represent not specific troops but the countless nameless men who died building the tomb. Their anonymity in life became their immortality in myth. Another dimension of the human cost is psychological. For those who worked on the mausoleum, the project was both awe-inspiring and terrifying. They were building not just a tomb but an underground empire, a city for the dead. They saw rivers of mercury being poured to mimic real landscapes, ceilings painted with stars to represent the heavens, and armies of clay figures rising from the earth. To the laborers, this must have seemed like stepping into another world, one where the emperor already ruled as a god. In such an atmosphere, death may have felt inevitable. To be part of the project was to enter a space where the boundary between life and death dissolved. It is also possible that some workers believed that serving the emperor in this way guaranteed them a place in the afterlife. In a society where rulers were seen as chosen by heaven, being buried near the emperor could be viewed as an honor, even if forced. This mindset would not lessen the cruelty, but it could have influenced how the practice was remembered and retold. The concept of sacrifice in ancient cultures was not always about voluntary offering. It was often about power. By taking the lives of his subjects, Qin Shi Huang demonstrated absolute authority, reinforcing his status as more than mortal. In this sense, every death on the mausoleum site was a political statement. The emperor's message was clear. His power extended beyond life into death. For modern observers, the mausoleum stands as a paradox. On one hand, it is a marvel of ancient engineering, a testament to human creativity and ambition. On the other, it is a monument built on suffering, a silent graveyard of thousands whose names are lost to history. The legend of 100,000 sacrificed soldiers crystallizes this paradox into a single narrative. It may not be literally true, but it conveys the essence of what the mausoleum represents: the triumph of ambition at the expense of human life. In this way, the legend serves not just as a question of fact but as a moral truth. Whether or not 100,000 soldiers were buried alive, the human cost of Qin Shi Huang's mausoleum was immense. The tomb is both a wonder and a warning, reminding us that the pursuit of immortality can demand a terrible price. As we continue to explore the site and its mysteries, we must remember the countless lives consumed by its construction. They may not have been soldiers in armor, but they were sacrificed all the same. To grasp the deeper meaning of the legend that Qin Shi Huang sacrificed 100,000 soldiers at his tomb, we must explore the religious and cultural beliefs that shaped ancient Chinese views on death, the afterlife, and sacrifice. In early Chinese civilization, death was not seen as an ending, but as a transition to another realm where the spirits of ancestors continued to exist. The living were bound to the dead through rituals, offerings, and respect. The belief in the mandate of heaven meant rulers were not just political leaders but also spiritual intermediaries, charged with maintaining harmony between the human world and the divine. Within this framework, burial practices took on immense importance. To ensure peace in the afterlife, rulers surrounded themselves with goods, treasures, and people who would serve them beyond death. During the Shang dynasty, human sacrifice was a prominent feature of elite burials. Archaeological excavations at Anyang, the Shang capital, reveal tombs containing not only bronze vessels and jade ornaments, but also the remains of slaves, servants, and soldiers buried alive with their masters. These sacrifices were seen as necessary offerings to accompany and protect the deceased ruler. By the Zhou dynasty, such practices declined, replaced by symbolic substitutes such as wooden figurines or clay statues. Yet the memory of these rituals lingered, forming part of cultural consciousness. Qin Shi Huang, seeking to surpass all previous rulers, may have drawn inspiration from these ancient traditions, reviving or expanding upon them to create his unparalleled mausoleum. Sacrifice in Chinese tradition was not always voluntary. It was often imposed by power, serving as a demonstration of authority. To command others to die for you, even after your death, was the ultimate expression of domination. In this light, the idea of Qin Shi Huang ordering soldiers to be buried alive fits symbolically with his reputation for absolute control. Even if it did not occur on the scale of 100,000, the concept resonated because it aligned with cultural expectations of what a ruler obsessed with immortality might do. The afterlife was imagined as a mirror of the living world. Just as rulers needed armies, servants, and wealth in life, they required them in death. Qin Shi Huang's clay army reflects this belief, providing him with eternal guardians. Yet stories of real soldiers sacrificed suggest an even darker extension of the idea, that he demanded not only symbolic representations but actual human lives to guarantee his supremacy in the next world. Religion and superstition reinforced such notions. Qin Shi Huang's reign was marked by fear of spirits and obsession with omens. He consulted diviners, alchemists, and magicians, searching for signs of destiny and ways to cheat death. The emperor's belief in immortality was not purely rational but rooted in a culture where spiritual power shaped reality. If he believed that live sacrifices could strengthen his tomb or appease supernatural forces, he may have ordered them without hesitation. Confucian values also played a role in how later generations interpreted these stories. Confucianism emphasized moral leadership, benevolence, and respect for human life. By contrast, the Qin dynasty's legalist philosophy prioritized order and punishment over compassion. To Confucian historians like Sima Qian, the tale of mass sacrifice symbolized the moral corruption of Qin rule. It was not just a story about death but a warning about the dangers of ruling without virtue. In this way, the legend became a moral allegory, amplified to teach future rulers that cruelty would bring ruin. Sacrifice also had political meaning. In many cultures, rulers used sacrifice to display their power publicly, reinforcing loyalty and fear. By burying soldiers or workers alive, Qin Shi Huang would have demonstrated that his authority extended beyond life itself. The act would have been both practical, ensuring silence and secrecy, and symbolic, asserting that the emperor commanded not only the living but also the dead. Over time, this symbolism may have been remembered more vividly than actual events, transforming the suffering of laborers into the myth of sacrificed soldiers. The number 100,000 carried its own weight in cultural imagination. Ancient texts often used large numbers symbolically to represent vastness or unimaginable scale. In ritual contexts, exaggeration was a way of emphasizing the magnitude of devotion or cruelty. Thus, when people spoke of 100,000 sacrificed, they may have meant simply an enormous, uncountable number. The exaggeration gave the story its haunting power, ensuring it endured in collective memory. Archaeological evidence of smaller-scale sacrifices strengthens the plausibility of the legend. Tombs of earlier rulers contain dozens or even hundreds of human victims. In comparison, the claim of 100,000 appears extreme, yet it follows the same logic. If smaller rulers required dozens, then surely the first emperor, with ambitions greater than all before him, would require vastly more. Whether or not this occurred, the reasoning made sense to those who told and retold the story. Folklore further shaped the tale. Over centuries, villagers near the mausoleum recounted stories of ghosts, strange lights, and cursed grounds. These tales often described moaning sounds at night, attributed to restless souls of sacrificed men. While not evidence in the scientific sense, folklore reflects how people understood their past and gave meaning to the ruins around them. For common folk, the mausoleum was not just an archaeological site, but a haunted place where the suffering of the dead still lingered. In this cultural atmosphere, the legend of sacrificed soldiers was not only plausible but inevitable. It blended historical practice, symbolic exaggeration, and moral allegory into a narrative that resonated across generations. Even without definitive proof, the story captured the essence of Qin Shi Huang's rule: ambition without compassion, power without restraint. From a comparative perspective, human sacrifice at royal tombs was not unique to China. Ancient Egypt buried servants and animals with pharaohs, while other cultures performed similar rites. What made the Qin legend distinctive was its scale. The idea of 100,000 soldiers exceeded anything recorded elsewhere, turning Qin Shi Huang into a figure of both awe and horror. In this sense, the legend elevated him to mythic status, ensuring his name would never fade. For modern scholars, the task is to separate fact from myth while acknowledging that myths themselves carry truth. Whether or not 100,000 soldiers died, the legend tells us what people feared, believed, and remembered. It reveals how sacrifice functioned not only as ritual but as narrative, shaping how history judged the first emperor. The story may not be literally true, but it embodies a deeper truth about the cost of absolute power. As we move forward, we must continue to examine the interplay between ritual, belief, and myth. The mausoleum remains a silent witness, holding secrets that may one day be revealed. Until then, the legend of sacrificed soldiers endures as part of China's cultural memory, reminding us that power, death, and faith are intertwined in ways that transcend the boundary between history and myth. The legend of Qin Shi Huang sacrificing 100,000 soldiers at his tomb may appear extreme. Yet when viewed in a global context, it fits within a broader pattern of rulers using human life as currency for power, memory, and the afterlife. Across ancient civilizations, monumental tombs were constructed not only as resting places, but as cosmic statements of authority. In each case, human lives were intertwined with the architecture of eternity. In Egypt, pharaohs built pyramids that still dominate the desert landscape. Early dynasties buried servants and retainers with the king, ensuring he would not lack companionship or service in the afterlife. Archaeological evidence from the first dynasty shows that entire retinues were killed and entombed alongside rulers. By the time of the Great Pyramids, such practices declined, replaced by symbolic substitutes, but the association between monumental tombs and sacrifice remained. The Great Pyramid itself may not have required sacrifices, but thousands of laborers worked under harsh conditions, and many perished in the process. Like Qin Shi Huang's mausoleum, the pyramid represents both genius and suffering, built on the backs of countless nameless men. In Mesopotamia, kings and queens of Ur were buried with attendants who appear to have been killed to accompany them into the afterlife. Excavations of the royal cemetery of Ur revealed bodies arranged neatly beside the dead ruler, suggesting ritual killing rather than random death. These sacrifices were interpreted as acts of loyalty or compulsion, reinforcing the belief that rulers commanded service even in death. Similarly, in the Americas, the Maya and Aztec civilizations practiced large-scale human sacrifice linked to religious and political power. The Aztec temples saw victims offered to the gods, their blood believed to sustain the cosmos. While these sacrifices were not tied to tombs in the same way as in China, they reflected the same principle: human life as an offering to secure cosmic order. For the Inca in South America, the practice of capicocha involved sacrificing children on mountaintops as offerings to deities. Though not associated with tomb building, these acts paralleled the logic of giving human life to sanctify power and eternity. Viewed against this backdrop, the legend of Qin Shi Huang appears less anomalous and more like part of a universal pattern. What sets his story apart, however, is its scale and the combination of symbolic artistry with alleged mass death. The terracotta army is unparalleled in world history, thousands of life-sized figures, each unique, arranged as an eternal guard. No other civilization produced such a vivid simulation of an army. The addition of 100,000 sacrificed soldiers in the legend magnifies this uniqueness, suggesting not only a symbolic army of clay but also a literal army of blood. The comparison with Egypt is particularly illuminating. Both Qin Shi Huang and the pharaohs sought immortality, both mobilized vast resources, and both left monuments that astonish later generations. Yet the Qin legend paints a darker picture. While pyramid builders were laborers who may have been paid or at least fed, the Qin workforce is remembered as prisoners, convicts, and unwilling soldiers driven to death. The difference may lie as much in memory as in fact. Egyptian rulers were deified and remembered with reverence, while Qin Shi Huang was vilified by successors. As a result, the same type of mass mobilization is remembered as devotion in Egypt but as sacrifice and cruelty in China. Another global parallel is found in the tombs of Scythian and steppe cultures. Excavations of kurgans, large burial mounds, reveal horses, servants, and sometimes wives buried with chieftains. In one case, more than a dozen attendants were found alongside a ruler, killed at the time of burial. These practices reinforce the idea that across Eurasia, elites believed they required human company in the afterlife. Qin Shi Huang, however, outdid them all by allegedly demanding not dozens but tens of thousands. In this way, the scale of his supposed sacrifice elevated his story into legend. Human sacrifice in connection with tombs also carried symbolic messages. By burying retainers or soldiers, rulers demonstrated their absolute power. Not even death could break loyalty. It was a declaration that the ruler's authority extended into eternity. For Qin Shi Huang, whose reign was marked by paranoia and desire for immortality, such symbolism would have been irresistible. The legend of 100,000 soldiers fits perfectly into this global logic, even if the exact number remains doubtful. Another perspective comes from the anthropology of memory. Societies often exaggerate past practices to emphasize moral lessons. Just as later generations in Egypt downplayed sacrifice to highlight glory, Chinese historians may have exaggerated sacrifice to highlight cruelty. The number itself may not matter. What mattered was the message. Tyranny consumes human lives. Yet, even with exaggeration, the global parallels show that some form of sacrifice was common, making the Qin story believable. One unique element of Qin Shi Huang's mausoleum is the fusion of art and death. The terracotta army is not just functional but aesthetic, each figure crafted with care. This contrasts with other cultures, where sacrificial victims were buried as bodies. In China, clay soldiers provided permanence, while human victims, if any, were erased by death. The combination suggests that Qin Shi Huang wanted both symbolic and real guardians, merging art with blood. This duality made the legend especially compelling. The scale of the project also fits within a broader pattern of rulers overreaching. The greater the ambition, the greater the cost. Just as pyramid building strained Egypt and Aztec sacrifices shocked the Spanish, the Qin mausoleum contributed to the collapse of its dynasty. In each case, the pursuit of eternal power carried seeds of destruction. From a modern viewpoint, comparing these practices raises moral questions. Were these sacrifices acts of devotion, coercion, or propaganda? Did victims believe they were serving a divine purpose, or were they unwilling participants? The ambiguity adds to the fascination. In Qin Shi Huang's case, the ambiguity is heightened by the sealed tomb. Until the central chamber is opened, we cannot know whether the stories of soldiers buried alive have any basis. Yet the very fact that such stories exist, and that they resonate globally, shows how sacrifice and tomb building are intertwined in human imagination. For audiences today, the global comparisons make Qin Shi Huang's story even more striking. He was not alone in demanding human life for his tomb, but he was unique in the alleged scale. His legend merges the global tradition of sacrifice with the singular vision of an underground empire guarded by clay. Whether true or myth, the story reflects universal themes: fear of death, desire for power, and the cost of ambition. By situating Qin Shi Huang within this global context, we see not only the uniqueness of his legend, but also its universality. All rulers sought to defy death, and many demanded lives to do so. Qin Shi Huang simply pushed this logic to its extreme, ensuring that his story would echo across cultures and centuries. In the modern era, The legend of Qin Shi Huang sacrificing 100,000 soldiers continues to attract attention not only from historians but also from scientists, archaeologists, and even conspiracy theorists. The discovery of the Terracotta Army in 1974 was only the beginning. Since then, decades of research have uncovered more about the mausoleum complex, yet the central burial chamber remains untouched, sealed beneath a mound of earth. The decision not to excavate has fueled speculation, for many believe that the truth about the sacrifices lies hidden within. Archaeologists face a dilemma. Ancient texts describe rivers of mercury flowing inside the tomb, creating miniature landscapes of China with mountains, rivers, and seas. Modern soil testing around the mound has revealed abnormally high levels of mercury, supporting these accounts. If accurate, the chamber could be lethally dangerous to open without advanced technology. Mercury vapor is toxic, and excavation could also destroy delicate artifacts. As a result, Chinese authorities have maintained a policy of preservation, preferring to wait until future technology ensures safe excavation. This has left the world in suspense, creating fertile ground for theories. Some scholars argue that if mass sacrifices occurred, evidence would lie in the sealed chamber, perhaps in the form of human remains or inscriptions. Others suggest that the absence of excavation means the legend will forever remain unproven, ensuring its survival as myth. Modern archaeological methods have added complexity to the debate. Remote sensing, ground-penetrating radar, and geophysical surveys suggest that the tomb chamber contains multiple structures, possibly palaces and corridors. These findings confirm the vast scale of the mausoleum but reveal little about sacrifices. The data hint at voids that could hold treasures or corpses, yet no definitive conclusions can be drawn without direct excavation. For now, the tomb guards its secrets. Scientific analysis has also focused on the Terracotta Army. Studies of the weapons found with the clay soldiers show advanced metallurgy. Some bronze swords, though buried for over 2 millennia, remain remarkably preserved, possibly due to chromium treatment. This level of technology surprised researchers and fueled speculation that Qin craftsmen possessed techniques lost for centuries. To some, the sophistication of the weapons suggests that the emperor's obsession with defense extended beyond symbolic clay figures to practical preparation, perhaps supported by live guards sacrificed to serve alongside them. Others remain skeptical, arguing that advanced craftsmanship does not prove human sacrifice. Modern historians often view the figure of 100,000 as exaggerated propaganda from Han historians, but they do not dismiss the possibility of smaller-scale sacrifices. Excavations have revealed human remains near the mausoleum that may belong to workers executed to maintain secrecy. These findings support the notion of targeted sacrifices, even if not on the legendary scale. Some modern Chinese scholars emphasize national pride, portraying Qin Shi Huang as a unifier and visionary rather than a cruel tyrant. From this perspective, stories of mass sacrifice are seen as slanders from rival dynasties. This debate reflects broader cultural tensions. Is Qin Shi Huang to be remembered as a founder of Chinese civilization or as a bloodthirsty despot? The answer influences how the legend of sacrifice is interpreted. Conspiracy theories add another layer. Some claim that the sealed tomb hides not only treasures but knowledge or technology far beyond its time. Speculations include secret maps, alchemical formulas, or even evidence of contact with other civilizations. These theories, while lacking evidence, persist because of the mystery surrounding the tomb. The refusal to excavate fuels suspicion, with some suggesting that authorities fear what might be revealed. Popular culture amplifies these theories, portraying Qin Shi Huang as a ruler dabbling in dark arts, commanding armies of the dead, or hiding forbidden knowledge. In reality, scientific evidence points to a mixture of wonder and danger within the tomb. High mercury levels, fragile artifacts, and unstable structures make excavation risky. Until technology advances, scholars can only hypothesize. For the legend of 100,000 sacrificed soldiers, this uncertainty ensures its survival. As long as the chamber remains closed, imagination fills the void. The use of modern technology also raises ethical questions. Should humanity disturb the tomb to answer historical questions, or should it remain sealed out of respect for cultural heritage? Excavation might confirm or refute the legend, but it could also destroy irreplaceable artifacts. Chinese archaeologists argue for caution, noting that when the terracotta warriors were first excavated, their vibrant paint faded rapidly upon exposure to air. Similar losses could occur on a greater scale within the tomb. This tension between knowledge and preservation mirrors the legend itself, the desire for truth colliding with the risk of destruction. From an academic standpoint, the debate over the sacrifices reflects deeper issues in historiography. How do we interpret ancient texts shaped by political agendas? How do we weigh myth against material evidence? The case of Qin Shi Huang demonstrates that history is not just about facts but about narratives created by power. Modern historians must balance skepticism with openness, acknowledging both the possibility of exaggeration and the reality of human suffering on a massive scale. Even if 100,000 soldiers were not literally buried alive, the project consumed countless lives through forced labor, secrecy, and execution. In this sense, the legend captures an essential truth, even if distorted. The global fascination with the tomb also reveals how myths endure when evidence is incomplete. The sealed chamber functions like a stage curtain, hiding the climax of a drama that has lasted 2 millennia. Every discovery, whether a clay warrior, a weapon, or a soil sample, adds to the anticipation. People long for resolution, yet the delay keeps the story alive. The possibility of sacrifice remains suspended between history and imagination. For many, the mystery itself is more powerful than any answer. If one day the chamber is opened and no evidence of sacrificed soldiers is found, the legend may fade. But until then, the ambiguity sustains its grip on human imagination. In conclusion, modern science and technology have both clarified and deepened the mystery of Qin Shi Huang's mausoleum. Evidence of mercury supports ancient accounts, while advanced metallurgy in weapons shows the sophistication of his craftsmen. Human remains suggest that lives were lost, though not necessarily in numbers as vast as the legend claims. Yet the central question remains unanswered because the tomb itself remains sealed. In this silence, theories multiply, scholarly, popular, and conspiratorial. The legend of 100,000 sacrificed soldiers survives not only because of ancient texts but because modern science has yet to deliver a final verdict. Until the tomb yields its secrets, the first emperor's mausoleum will remain both an archaeological wonder and a symbol of the human cost of ambition, balanced precariously between truth and myth. The legend that Qin Shi Huang sacrificed 100,000 soldiers at his tomb has survived not only through historical records but also through folklore, literature, and cultural storytelling. In many ways, the persistence of this tale reveals more about how societies remember than about what truly happened. From the fall of the Qin dynasty onward, storytellers, poets, and common people shaped the emperor's image as both a great unifier and a cruel tyrant, embedding the sacrifice legend into collective memory. Folklore has always thrived on exaggeration, and in rural China the mausoleum became a place of fear and fascination. Local villagers told stories of spirits wandering the fields at night, voices crying from beneath the earth, and poisonous vapors rising from the ground. These tales were passed down orally, warning children not to venture near the mound. To them, the story of 100,000 soldiers was not abstract history but a lived presence in the landscape. The land itself seemed haunted by the emperor's cruelty, and every unusual occurrence, strange lights, sudden illness, or animal deaths, was linked to the tomb. In literature, the image of Qin Shi Huang as a ruthless despot became entrenched early. Han Dynasty writers emphasized his tyranny to contrast with their own supposedly benevolent rule. They described not only the burning of books and the burying of scholars but also the entombment of soldiers, creating a composite image of cruelty. Poets portrayed him as a man who enslaved both the living and the dead, whose quest for immortality was built on rivers of blood. In later dynasties, playwrights and novelists amplified these themes. Historical novels like Records of the Grand Historian inspired dramatizations in theater, where the emperor was often depicted as a villain consumed by paranoia. In these stories, the sacrifice of soldiers symbolized his madness, his inability to distinguish between life and death, between loyalty and fear. Folklore and art worked together to cement the legend. In paintings and woodblock prints, the mausoleum was sometimes depicted as a dark fortress guarded by both clay and human soldiers. Artists imagined pits filled with corpses, overseen by a tyrant emperor in dragon robes. These images may not have been literal depictions, but they captured the essence of the myth. A tomb that was also a prison for souls. In modern times, film and television have kept the legend alive. Movies often dramatize Qin Shi Huang as a larger-than-life figure who commands armies in both life and death. Chinese cinema and international documentaries alike present his mausoleum as a place of mystery, shrouded in secrecy and horror. The legend of sacrificed soldiers becomes a visual spectacle, thousands of men sealed in darkness, their loyalty twisted into eternal servitude. Even when scholars argue that the story is exaggerated, filmmakers and writers embrace it for dramatic effect. Popular culture thrives on ambiguity, and the mystery of the sealed tomb provides endless inspiration. Novels mix history with fantasy, suggesting that the sacrificed soldiers became restless ghosts or guardians cursed to protect the emperor forever. In some versions, they are transformed into the clay figures themselves, as if real soldiers were petrified into eternal statues. This fusion of myth and archaeology appeals to audiences because it provides a supernatural explanation for the lifelike individuality of the terracotta army. Folklore also adapted to political needs. During times of upheaval, rebels invoked the legend of Qin Shi Huang's cruelty as a symbol of tyranny. By portraying him as the ultimate oppressor, they justified resistance against contemporary rulers. The story of 100,000 sacrificed soldiers was retold as a cautionary tale. When rulers disregard the lives of their people, their dynasties are doomed. The Qin's collapse within 15 years became proof of this moral. Over time, the legend transcended China's borders. Western travelers and historians, fascinated by the terracotta army, repeated the story of mass sacrifice. In translation and retelling, details shifted, sometimes becoming even more extreme. To foreign audiences, the idea of an Oriental despot burying armies alive fit stereotypes of exotic cruelty. The legend became part of a global imagination, reinforcing both awe and horror of the first emperor. This international transmission gave the tale new life, ensuring it spread beyond its original cultural context. Cultural memory often reshapes stories to meet the needs of each era. In traditional China, the legend emphasized tyranny and divine punishment. In modern nationalist narratives, Qin Shi Huang is sometimes reframed as a unifier and visionary, while the darker legends are downplayed. Yet the story of sacrificed soldiers never disappears completely, because it speaks to universal fears about power and mortality. It is too compelling to erase, even if scholars question its accuracy. Oral tradition remains a powerful force. In villages near Xi'an, older generations still tell tales of ghosts tied to the mausoleum. Tour guides repeat versions of the story for visitors, blending fact and legend to create atmosphere. In classrooms, the story is sometimes taught with caution, labeled as myth but still presented as part of cultural heritage. The ambiguity itself becomes educational, showing how history and myth intertwine. Even folklore outside China has drawn on the story. Writers of fantasy and historical fiction borrow elements from Qin Shi Huang's legend, transplanting them into novels and films. The image of a tyrant entombed with an army of the dead appears in multiple cultures, inspired by the Chinese tale. In this way, the myth has become archetypal, transcending its origin. Why does this legend endure so powerfully? Because it resonates with core human themes: fear of death, the desire for immortality, and the cost of ambition. It dramatizes the conflict between ruler and subject, between power and humanity. It offers a moral lesson wrapped in horror, warning that no matter how great a ruler, cruelty will lead to downfall. Myths survive not because they are true but because they are meaningful. In the case of Qin Shi Huang, the legend of sacrificed soldiers carries symbolic truth even if the factual details remain uncertain. In sum, Part 9 shows how the legend of 100,000 sacrificed soldiers lives on through folklore, literature, art, and modern media. It has been reshaped for political agendas, moral lessons, and popular entertainment. The tale is not static. It evolves with each generation, yet its core remains, a story of ambition, cruelty, and the price of immortality. Until the sealed tomb is opened, folklore will continue to fill the silence with images of soldiers entombed alive, their voices echoing in cultural memory. In the modern world, the legend of Qin Shi Huang sacrificing 100,000 soldiers has transcended the boundaries of history to become a cultural force shaping tourism, media, and global perceptions of China. The Terracotta Army, discovered in 1974, is now one of the most visited archaeological sites in the world, drawing millions of tourists each year. Visitors come not only to marvel at the artistry of the clay figures, but also to feel the mystery of the sealed tomb, where the legend of sacrificed soldiers lingers like an unspoken presence. Tour guides frequently mention the story, framing it as part of the atmosphere. Even when labeled as myth, it adds drama and intrigue, making the site more compelling. For many tourists, the possibility that real men were buried alive alongside clay warriors heightens the sense of awe and horror. The narrative enriches the experience, transforming the mausoleum from a static ruin into a stage where history and legend coexist. The legend also plays a role in how China presents its cultural heritage to the world. The Terracotta Army has become a symbol of Chinese civilization, appearing in exhibitions, documentaries, and international showcases. The story of the first emperor's tomb, with its rumors of sacrifice and rivers of mercury, captures global imagination in ways few other sites can. It conveys both the grandeur and the darkness of ancient China, offering a narrative of power, ambition, and mystery. While the Chinese government emphasizes the achievements of Qin Shi Huang as a unifier, it does not entirely suppress the darker legends, recognizing their value in attracting attention. In media and popular culture, the legend thrives. Documentaries dramatize the emperor's obsession with immortality, mixing archaeological evidence with tales of sacrifice. Television series portray the mausoleum as a haunted place where soldiers' souls remain trapped. International films, such as those in the fantasy or adventure genre, borrow heavily from the imagery of armies buried alive, cursed tombs, and eternal guardians. Even video games incorporate Qin Shi Huang and his Terracotta Army, often depicting them as supernatural forces. The persistence of the legend in modern entertainment demonstrates its adaptability. It appeals to universal themes of horror, mystery, and the supernatural. Whether in a serious documentary or a Hollywood blockbuster, the idea of 100,000 sacrificed soldiers remains irresistible because it dramatizes the cost of ambition. For global audiences, it symbolizes both fascination with Chinese history and fear of unchecked power. The tourism industry directly benefits from this fascination. Xi'an, once a relatively quiet region, has become a major tourist destination because of the mausoleum. Hotels, restaurants, and cultural events thrive on the influx of visitors drawn by the Terracotta Army and the legend behind it. Local folklore is packaged into performances, and souvenir shops sell replicas of clay warriors. The story of sacrificed soldiers, though unproven, acts as a marketing tool, enhancing the mystique of the site. For many visitors, the question of whether the legend is true is less important than the thrill of wondering. The legend also shapes academic and political debates about heritage. Archaeologists emphasize the need to preserve the tomb, while some argue for excavation to resolve the questions once and for all. The uncertainty fuels both scholarship and public interest. Politically, the story of Qin Shi Huang reflects broader tensions in China's historical narrative. On one hand, he is celebrated as the man who unified China, a symbol of strength and central authority. On the other hand, the legend of mass sacrifice embodies tyranny and cruelty. Balancing these two images is delicate. By highlighting his achievements while acknowledging the legends, Chinese authorities can claim both grandeur and mystery, presenting the mausoleum as a cultural treasure while deflecting moral judgment. Internationally, the legend contributes to how China is perceived. To some, it illustrates the antiquity and complexity of Chinese civilization. To others, it reinforces stereotypes of authoritarianism and cruelty. In global discourse, Qin Shi Huang's mausoleum becomes a metaphor for power built on human suffering. The idea of soldiers sacrificed for a ruler's tomb resonates with contemporary concerns about oppression and the abuse of power. Thus, the legend functions not just as history but as political commentary, shaping perceptions of China past and present. Modern scholarship also engages with the legend as a case study in how myths form and endure. Historians analyze how propaganda, folklore, and cultural memory blend to create narratives that outlive their factual basis. The story of 100,000 sacrificed soldiers becomes an example of how societies construct moral lessons out of history. It shows that what people believe can be as influential as what actually happened. For educators, the legend provides an opportunity to teach about critical thinking, evidence, and the relationship between myth and reality. Beyond tourism and scholarship, the legend influences art and literature. Contemporary Chinese authors reimagine Qin Shi Huang's tomb in novels, sometimes portraying the sacrificed soldiers as restless ghosts demanding justice. Poets use the story as a metaphor for ambition and downfall. International writers incorporate the myth into historical fiction and fantasy, often emphasizing its gothic and supernatural elements. The story's adaptability across genres demonstrates its enduring cultural power. In the digital age, the legend spreads through social media, where short videos and articles sensationalize the idea of 100,000 sacrificed soldiers. Online platforms amplify dramatic narratives, often without distinguishing fact from speculation. Viral content thrives on ambiguity, and the legend's unresolved status makes it perfect material. Millions of people encounter the story online, sometimes as entertainment, sometimes as pseudo-history. This digital circulation ensures that the legend reaches new generations worldwide. Economically, the legend contributes to heritage branding. Xi'an markets itself as the home of the terracotta warriors, while national campaigns highlight the mausoleum as proof of China's ancient greatness. At the same time, the darker aspects of the legend are leveraged to attract interest. Mystery sells, and the possibility of mass sacrifice adds depth to the narrative. Visitors are not just looking at statues. They are engaging with a story that blurs fact and myth. For China, this duality offers both opportunity and challenge. The legend enhances cultural prestige but also raises uncomfortable questions about the human cost of power. In conclusion, the legend of Qin Shi Huang sacrificing 100,000 soldiers has become more than a historical debate. It is a cultural phenomenon that shapes tourism, media, politics, and global perception. It enriches the site of the mausoleum, giving it layers of meaning that attract millions. It fuels entertainment and scholarship, functioning as both myth and metaphor. Whether true or not, it embodies the enduring tension between ambition and humanity, power and morality. In the modern world, the legend continues to thrive because it speaks to timeless concerns, reminding us that history's greatest mysteries are often those that remain unresolved. While the legend of Qin Shi Huang sacrificing 100,000 soldiers at his tomb has captivated imaginations for centuries, many modern historians and archaeologists argue that the story is a product of exaggeration, propaganda, and cultural memory rather than literal fact. The skeptical perspective begins with the logistical challenge of such a sacrifice. To bury 100,000 soldiers alive would have required enormous planning, resources, and secrecy. The Qin dynasty maintained a vast army, but removing such a large portion of its fighting force would have weakened national security. The empire still faced threats from nomadic groups in the north and the constant risk of rebellion within. Scholars point out that no ruler obsessed with stability and defense would deliberately decimate his own military in this way. The number itself raises doubts. In ancient Chinese texts, large numbers were often used symbolically to signify vastness rather than precise counts. Terms like 10,000 or 100,000 frequently appeared as rhetorical flourishes. Historians argue that the phrase 100,000 soldiers may simply have meant an enormous number of people, rather than a literal figure. When later generations retold the story, they may have taken the number literally, magnifying the sense of horror. Archaeological evidence also fails to support the claim. Excavations around the mausoleum have uncovered human remains, but not on the scale of 100,000. Some remains belong to laborers or artisans who died during construction, likely from exhaustion, disease, or execution. Others may represent smaller-scale sacrifices, but nothing suggests mass pits containing armies of soldiers. Given the extent of excavation around the terracotta army pits, scholars argue that if such vast burials existed, we would expect at least some evidence by now. The silence of the soil undermines the literal interpretation of the legend. Another line of skepticism comes from the political context of the historical sources. The primary written account of Qin Shi Huang's tomb comes from Sima Qian, writing during the Han dynasty. The Han rulers had every reason to vilify the Qin to legitimize their own rule. By portraying the first emperor as a cruel tyrant who sacrificed soldiers and scholars, the Han emphasized their own supposed benevolence. Many scholars argue that the story of 100,000 sacrificed soldiers was a form of propaganda, designed to exaggerate Qin cruelty and explain why the dynasty collapsed so quickly. The rapid fall of the Qin dynasty within 15 years of the first emperor's death made it easy for later historians to present his cruelty as the cause. To the Han, the story served as a moral lesson. Tyranny leads to downfall. But the actual events may have been less dramatic. Skeptics argue that while forced labor and executions certainly occurred, mass ritual sacrifice of soldiers was unlikely. They suggest that the legend grew out of the real suffering of hundreds of thousands of laborers, whose deaths were later mythologized as formal sacrifice. In this sense, the legend contains symbolic truth but not literal accuracy. Some archaeologists also emphasize that the terracotta army itself makes mass sacrifice unnecessary. The sheer number of clay soldiers, over 8,000, already served the symbolic purpose of providing guardians in the afterlife. If Qin Shi Huang invested such immense resources into creating an artificial army, why would he also waste real soldiers? The lifelike individuality of the figures may have convinced later generations that they were based on actual men sacrificed and immortalized in clay, but this interpretation is not supported by direct evidence. The skeptics further point to practical considerations. Killing 100,000 soldiers would have required immense pits, ceremonies, and resources to manage bodies. The logistical complexity would have left clear archaeological traces. No such evidence has been found. Even if the central chamber remains unexcavated, the surrounding areas should reveal mass burials if such an event occurred. Instead, what has been found are scattered remains of workers, suggesting localized deaths rather than systematic sacrifice on a massive scale. Another argument comes from the evolution of Chinese burial practices. By the time of the Qin, large-scale human sacrifice had largely fallen out of favor. Earlier dynasties like the Shang practiced it extensively, but later periods replaced human victims with figurines or symbolic substitutes. Qin Shi Huang's creation of the terracotta army fits this transition. Skeptics argue that rather than reviving archaic practices, the first emperor innovated with an unprecedented scale of symbolic representation. In this view, the terracotta army was a modern solution for its time, not accompanied by mass human deaths. Some scholars also highlight psychological bias. Qin Shi Huang's reputation for cruelty makes the legend believable, even if untrue. Because he burned books, buried scholars, and forced laborers to build massive projects, people assume he was capable of anything. This reputation creates fertile ground for exaggeration. The story of sacrificed soldiers aligns with expectations, which is why it persisted, but alignment with expectation does not equal evidence. Skeptical voices further note that cultural memory tends to amplify suffering. The thousands of lives lost to forced labor may have been reinterpreted as deliberate sacrifice over centuries of retelling. Families who never saw their men return may have imagined them buried alive, giving rise to the legend. Over time, this narrative hardened into accepted truth. To modern historians, this illustrates how trauma and myth intertwine. Comparative analysis also supports skepticism. Other civilizations that practiced human sacrifice did so on smaller scales relative to their populations. The figure of 100,000 exceeds known examples worldwide. Even the bloodiest Aztec rituals or the largest retainer burials in Egypt and Mesopotamia did not reach such numbers. For skeptics, this suggests exaggeration designed to magnify horror rather than describe reality. Finally, skeptics warn against romanticizing myth at the expense of evidence. While the story of 100,000 sacrificed soldiers is compelling, clinging to it without proof risks misunderstanding history. The real tragedy of Qin Shi Huang's mausoleum lies not in dramatic rituals, but in the relentless exploitation of laborers who died from exhaustion and brutality. Their suffering was no less real, even if it lacked the spectacle of mass sacrifice. In conclusion, the skeptical perspective emphasizes propaganda, exaggeration, and absence of evidence. The number 100,000 is seen as symbolic rather than literal. The lack of mass graves undermines the claim. The terracotta army itself suggests substitution rather than sacrifice. Cultural memory, political agendas, and the emperor's reputation for cruelty combine to produce a legend that reflects symbolic truth but not historical fact. For skeptics, the story remains a powerful myth that illustrates the cost of tyranny, but not a literal account of events. The debate will continue until the tomb is opened, but from a critical standpoint, the evidence weighs against the reality of 100,000 sacrificed soldiers. As we reach the end of the exploration into the legend of Qin Shi Huang sacrificing 100,000 soldiers to build his tomb, we are left with a story that is both illuminating and elusive. Across history, archaeology, folklore, and modern imagination, the line between truth and myth blurs. What we know for certain is that Qin Shi Huang was a ruler of unmatched ambition, a man who unified China and laid the foundation for 2 millennia of imperial rule. What remains uncertain is whether he also carried his obsession with control to the point of slaughtering an entire army to accompany him into death. The truth may never be fully revealed, but the legend itself carries lessons more profound than numbers. The evidence uncovered so far paints a picture of extraordinary scale. The mausoleum, covering more than 50 square kilometers, is the largest known burial complex in the world. The terracotta army, with over 8,000 life-sized figures, astonishes with its individuality and craftsmanship. Traces of mercury in the soil suggest that ancient texts describing rivers of liquid metal inside the tomb may be accurate. Human remains discovered around the site confirm that lives were lost, whether from exhaustion, execution, or sacrifice. Yet none of this proves the claim of 100,000 soldiers. Archaeology shows suffering on a vast scale, but not ritual slaughter of that magnitude. Historians argue that the number was likely symbolic, a rhetorical flourish used to magnify cruelty. The Han dynasty's political agenda further distorted the story, emphasizing tyranny to contrast with their own rule. Cultural memory amplified the legend, turning the laborers and artisans who died into soldiers sacrificed in myth. Over centuries, the story evolved, retold as folklore, dramatized in literature, and sensationalized in modern media. The legend survives because it resonates with universal human concerns. It dramatizes the fear of death, the quest for immortality, and the cost of ambition. For Qin Shi Huang, the pursuit of eternal power was relentless. He sought elixirs of life, consumed mercury pills, and sent expeditions across seas. His mausoleum was the ultimate expression of this obsession. A city for the dead, guarded by armies of clay and perhaps of blood. Whether or not he sacrificed 100,000 soldiers, he certainly sacrificed countless lives through forced labor. The distinction between work to death and ritual sacrifice may be less important than the shared reality of human suffering. In this sense, the legend is true in spirit, even if not in detail. Myth often conveys moral truth more effectively than fact. The story of sacrificed soldiers has endured because it teaches lessons. It warns against absolute power, showing how rulers who treat people as expendable ultimately destroy their own dynasties. The Qin collapsed within 15 years of the first emperor's death, undone by resentment and rebellion. To later generations, this confirmed the moral: cruelty leads to downfall. The legend also serves as a reminder of the price of ambition. Qin Shi Huang achieved greatness, but at immense cost. His projects consumed lives, his paranoia created fear, and his obsession poisoned him. In the end, he died like all men, leaving behind not immortality but a tomb shrouded in mystery. The 100,000 sacrificed soldiers symbolize the futility of trying to control death with violence. They represent the ultimate irony. In seeking eternal power, the emperor ensured that his memory would be defined by cruelty rather than glory. For modern audiences, the legend continues to hold relevance. It speaks to the dangers of authoritarianism, the exploitation of labor, and the human cost of monumental ambition. It reminds us that history is not only about rulers and monuments but about the countless nameless individuals whose lives were consumed. The legend gives voice to the voiceless, turning their forgotten suffering into a narrative that endures. At the same time, the legend challenges us to question how history is written. The absence of evidence for 100,000 sacrifices forces us to consider the role of propaganda, exaggeration, and cultural memory. It shows that history is never neutral but shaped by power and perspective. The Han dynasty's vilification of the Qin, the folklore of villagers, and the dramatizations of filmmakers all contribute to a tapestry where truth and myth are inseparable. Perhaps this inseparability is the final lesson. Qin Shi Huang's tomb itself embodies the tension between known and unknown. The terracotta army is visible, but the central chamber remains sealed. Soil tests reveal mercury, but we cannot see the rivers described in texts. Human remains are found, but not on the scale of the legend. The tomb speaks in fragments, leaving imagination to fill the gaps. This silence sustains the legend, making it more powerful than certainty ever could. If the chamber were opened tomorrow and revealed no sacrificed soldiers, the story might lose some of its allure. But as long as it remains closed, the possibility lingers, and the legend thrives. The 100,000 sacrificed soldiers are, in a sense, both real and unreal. They exist as symbols of the laborers who died, as exaggerations of historians, as ghosts in folklore, and as images in art. They may not lie beneath the soil in literal form, but they live in cultural memory, reminding us of the costs of empire. Qin Shi Huang's story shows that immortality comes not from defeating death but from shaping memory. He failed to live forever, but he succeeded in ensuring that his name would never be forgotten. Ironically, it is not his unification of China or his reforms that captivate the world today but the legends of his tomb. The 100,000 sacrificed soldiers, whether true or myth, have given him eternal presence in human imagination. In conclusion, the legend of Qin Shi Huang's sacrificed soldiers is less about numbers than about meaning. It embodies the intersection of history, myth, and morality. It reflects the grandeur and horror of human ambition. It warns of the dangers of power without compassion. And it reminds us that the voices of the forgotten, amplified through legend, can echo across millennia. The truth may remain sealed beneath the earth, but the lesson is clear. No empire, no ruler, no army of clay or blood can conquer death. What remains is the story, and in that story the 100,000 sacrificed soldiers march forever, symbols of both human suffering and the eternal quest for immortality.